My name is Christian Novak, a representative of the Military Education Preservation Project, and I am at the home of Ernest Purcell on this day, June 6th, 2020, talking to Mr. Purcell about his time in the service. Mr. Purcell, can you start by giving us some background information on yourself, starting with where you were born?
Born in Jackson County, Georgia, May the 18th, 1926.
And what did your parents do?
My father and mother, of course, in that day, most everybody from the country farmed, and that's what both of them did in their early years. And Dad, when he left home, he was hunting a job, and he wound up in Greensboro, North Carolina. And then Mother and I went to Greensboro, and I lived in Greensboro with them until she died when I was 13. And shortly thereafter, he moved back to Commerce, Georgia, in Jackson County. And I stayed there for about, I guess, 2 years, and went in the military, went in the Navy. And that began my career.
So you enlisted?
Yeah.
When did you enlist?
Well, I enlisted in June of 42, and I was in the Navy, and I enlisted for 4 years. They called it a kiddie cruise. I was still a kid. In fact, we fudged a little bit to get me in, and a lot of boys did back then, because in that war, World War II, there was a feeling of well, I need to go in. The flag, everybody loved the flag, and so I wanted to go in. I wanted to go in so bad that my dad finally agreed to sign for me, and he fudged a little bit too, so I went in at 16 rather than 17.
Mm-hmm.
And then when they took a bunch of us to Macon, and back during that time, and still, I guess, kids think that they're grown when they get in their teenage years. And I thought I was grown until I got in there, and I found out, sure enough, I wasn't grown at all. And I'll never forget, we were in the courthouse, I guess it was, in Macon, in a courtroom, and we were all seated, and a man walked out in whites. Navy was clothed in whites, and he walked out and says, "Whenever I call your name, say here and stand up." Well, I happened to be the first name he called, and I stood up, and he dressed me down. That means, when he dressed me down, that means he chewed me out and said, "Whenever I call your name, next time you say here and stand up." So I said here and stand up, but I thought I was in the wrong place, getting chewed out. I said, "Daddy never chewed me out like that." So that started my Navy career.
And then how did they choose where you went?
How did they choose?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I don't know how they chose, but And I don't know how many stations where they had what they call boot camp. So they began with very basic training, but they sent me to Norfolk, Virginia, and a friend of mine. There were 3 of us that started to join the Army. Alfred Tucker, Jack Moss, and myself. Neither one of us had a car, so we had to hitchhike, and we were going to hitchhike to Athens. So we got out on the road to hitchhike. We had to go through Jefferson, and we got out there, and Jack Moss got chicken, and he says to Alfred and myself, says, "You all go ahead. I believe I'll go back home." So we caught a ride to Jefferson, and then we had to catch a ride from there to Athens, and a guy in a coupe stopped by and says, "I'll carry one of you, but I won't carry both of you." And I says, "Well, Alfred," I said, "you go on, I believe I'll go back home." So I went back home, and I still wasn't satisfied, so one day Daddy says, "Well, since you want to go to bed, I'll sign for you." And I did. I wanted to go so bad, so he signed for me at 16. So they sent me to Norfolk, and then from Norfolk, they sent me to Newport, Rhode Island, and to a gunner's mate school. Well, I wasn't so much on studying back then, so I lacked a couple of points being getting a rank from gunner's mate school. So they sent me back to Norfolk to catch the Ranger aircraft carrier. And I'll never forget looking at that aircraft carrier the first time. The largest boat I'd ever seen was a rowboat going down a creek. Not a river, but a creek, a rowboat. And here I'm looking up at that ship, 700, I believe 759 feet long. And we're carrying 3 squadrons of airplanes capacity. And it was awesome. It's scary. Well, I went aboard there, and they had us on the hangar deck, lined up, and they were going to make assignments. Now, most of the guys went on what they called a deck crew. They were swabbies, and that's where I would have gone, except for the fact that a chief petty officer came out. He was looking for volunteers. And when he said that he wanted a volunteer for the supply department, somebody, and I have no idea who, pushed me right out in front of him. And so I became his volunteer. And I'm glad I did, because I escaped the mops and swabs, cleaning the flight deck and whatever other deck they had, you know. And so that began my experience with the supply department. I learned what it was all about. And the next morning, okay, back during that time, they had bunks, but they were still using a few hammocks. You know, early on, sailors slept on hammocks. Well, they gave us a hammock whenever we went in. And that hammock and a little, very thin mattress was folded up in that hammock. And then that was kind of wrapped around your sea bag. And you could tie that together. And that was your total possessions outside of your clothes you had on. So the first night or two we were on the Ranger, we slept on a hammock. Well, I got up in the morning, and it was in the dining room or mess hall. And guess who I saw? Alfred Tucker. Alfred Tucker had gone in and gone to basic training in Illinois, close to Chicago, and then they put him aboard the Ranger. Well, long story short, Alfred Tucker stayed in the Navy until he retired. Jack Moss, the first one to bail out on us, waited until he was drafted in the Army, and he was killed. So that's kind of the story of all three of us who started to go in together. And so I stayed on the Ranger as a storekeeper in a supply department, working most of the time in the office, and then finally, before I was transferred off of the ship, they kind of made me a aviation storekeeper. Keeping up with aviation clothing, and that's about the story of that phase of my life. Except if I begin to relate the affairs of the entire ship. When I went aboard the ship, they had just, that ship, among many others, had just experienced the invasion of Africa. And I don't remember the name of the exercise, but they had just experienced that invasion.
Is that Operation Torch? Operation Torch?
Could have been. I don't remember. Torch? Could have been. It could have been. I don't remember. But anyway, there were a lot of submarines and all in that. Several of the ships got sunk, and but the Ranger made it through, and then, of course, I caught it. And from then on, the entire time, not the entire time, well, the rest of the time that we were in the Atlantic, the ship was operating throughout the Atlantic Ocean from Gibraltar, Casablanca, up through the Arctic Ocean, and we went back to Casablanca a few times. That ship was deemed to be too light for warfare in the Pacific. It was one of a kind. The first aircraft carrier where the keel was laid to be a carrier, but it was too light. It was too light. It was, and when I say too light, the armament was too light. The protection was too light. The metal was too thin. And it didn't have enough power to get out of the way, you know, of what was required in the Pacific. So they kept it in the Atlantic to operate with the British Home Fleet, looking for submarines and German naval vessels, particularly battleships. So we that was our mission, but we were not through with the African group, because we were designated on 2 occasions to ferry or take airplanes back to Morocco for use in the African invasion. One of the groups that we took were P-40s. With the P-40s, we took pilots and airplanes. Well, they were fixed wing airplanes, so we took them, and an incident I'll never forget. When they flew off of the ship, they came back and saluted the ship, and they came so low. I remember standing in the open bay on the hangar deck, and when they came down on the water coming back to the ship, they were so near the water, their props were picking up spray from the ocean, from the water, and they came up and over the ship and gone, never to see them anymore. But it was a beautiful sight, and to me, beautiful day. No waves, just ground swells, and we were so close. We were between Morocco and the Rock of Gibraltar at the entrance of the Mediterranean Sea when that happened. And then later on, we took a load of P-38s. The wings were off of them. We took those P-38s over there. No pilots, just the planes. And then we went on back up in the Atlantic. And I imagine that's when we began to go into places like Halifax, Nova Scotia, Argentia, Newfoundland, places like that. And that's when we were in Argentia, Newfoundland, and the storm came up, and the captain or admiral or whoever was the officer, I guess it was a flag officer, admiral, determined that we needed to go out to sea so that we wouldn't be swept aground in that storm. And when we got outside of the net that was securing the bay, there was a submarine, German submarine out there. Captain or commanded by von Bülow, and he shot some torpedoes at us, missed us, of course. But we were known then for a good long while as the ghost ship. He didn't get us, and we appeared again, so we appeared as the ghost. And that's when I went home on leave.
So von Bülow reported that y'all were sunk.
Oh yeah, he was highly decorated. I don't remember the medals he got from Hitler, but he was highly decorated. And then we appeared. It's not sunk. And we were operating with a British home fleet, looking for those naval vessels. So we operated around Iceland, Norway, up in the Arctic Ocean, Greenland, Scotland, and then on one occasion they wanted to make a strike in Norway. Yeah, in Norway. That's when I said we were maybe 100 miles or 50 miles or whatever off of the coast. But when they went in to destroy shipping. And when they got there, they found an airstrip I didn't know was there. You know, we didn't have the facilities for discovery back then that you got now. You got all these eyes in the sky. You know, now looking down, we didn't have that then. But anyway, they tore that airstrip up and destroyed several ships and airplanes. And some of our pilots were wounded. And I remember one of them was wounded in the posterior part of his anatomy. And when the captain gave him his Purple Heart, he told him he's going to have to wear it where he got hurt. You know, that would have been kind of hard to do. But anyway, yeah, when you go to have an operation like that, you've got a certain number of airplanes that cover you, and so they keep those, to keep those German planes off of us. And
So did the German planes retaliate?
they tried to.
Okay.
They tried to, but they were shot down. Yeah. And I don't know how many of them there were, but there were some, more than one.
What kind of planes did the Ranger carry?
The Ranger, well, torpedo bombers. They could carry bombs or torpedoes. They were, I think the designation was TBF, torpedo bomber fighter. And seems to me like that plane had there was either the pilot and two other, seemed to me like there were three people in that plane. I don't remember. But the TBF and SB-2C Scout dive bomber. We had, you had a squadron of dive bombers. And then you had at different times we had different fighters. Earlier on there was the designation, there was sometimes there was two F2, F4, and then F6s. And of course back then they were all prop planes. But yeah, they were different. One at different times. Yeah, sometime those planes would come back and they'd be all shot up, tore up. And they would jump the barriers. You know, you had cables that would raise up just above the deck, and then the most forward cable rose up pretty good piece from the deck, you know, barrier. And sometimes they'd jump everything, you know. Sometimes they'd careen and hit the superstructure of the island, you know. Sometimes they would go in the opposite direction, you know, and they'd have to throw them overboard, but and then sometimes if the planes were operating in battle, when they came back, they would position them on the forward end of the flight deck and gas them again, you know. We had two elevators that would take them up and down from the hangar deck, you know. And at one time, I recall, as I told you last time, my bunk was immediately under the flight deck. And there was a time when a plane jumped that main barrier and landed on some of those planes that were positioned on the forward end of the flight deck. And said it got hairy sometimes. It was dangerous. Mm-hmm. I reckon that's about the most dangerous 2 acres of real estate in the world. It's busy. It's busy. Whether it was on that aircraft carrier or another aircraft carrier, that's a busy place. And it got these guys up there with various colors on, you know, depending on what they did, you know, if they were firemen or if they were handling bombs or torpedoes, you know, they had a different color clothing on, but everybody was busy. And I remember one time, well, you had to line up to do everything. You lined up to get a haircut. You lined up. You stood in line to get paid. You stood in line to chow line, you know. And I was in line up on the hangar deck. They were starting engines in the planes that were on the hangar deck. And they always did, they had a rope around the guys holding the rope, you know, and that kind of thing. And I remember a guy turned the wrong way. They had just started his plane, and he turned the wrong way and turned into the prop. And it caught him in his shoulder. Now those props, those are metal props, and they don't give. But you see a lot of stuff like that. You see a lot of stuff like that. And, but anyway.
So you were in the Atlantic and the Pacific, correct?
Yeah.
So how did you go from the Atlantic to the Pacific?
Before we get into that, in Scotland, we spent some time in and out of Scotland, and with the British Home Fleet, and in the islands in North Scotland, you got the Orkney Islands. I told Ernie about it. If they he and Debbie take a trip, they need to go up there. And in the Orkney Islands, Scapa-Flow, Scotland, where the German fleet was scuttled. And that's where I was first introduced to fish and chips. It was quite an experience. But we went to go to the Pacific, we went down and went through the Panama Canal. And the reason we went over to into the Pacific was that they had identified the Ranger as train pilots. So we went over there to go back and forth between San Diego and Honolulu, back and forth, training pilots. So they used us for a landing field. First time, you know, they would land and take off, greenhorn pilots, So that's what we did while we were after we got over in the Pacific. And of course, after I'd been over there a while, they transferred me off of that ship. I probably wasn't any good for them, so they transferred me off. And as the United States would secure the islands, they'd fight, win, secure an island, and of course they had to have equipment. So that's what I did as a storekeeper, working those on the first ship, well, the first supply ship I was on was a tri-store ship. And the second one I was on was a refrigerated ship. Had a lot of good meat on that one, But they were merchant ships. And operated by the Maritime, had merchant marines on there. And one of the first things they told us was, don't gamble with the merchant marines because they made a whole lot more money than we did, so don't gamble with them. That was a no-no. And that was when you go into these islands that had just been secured. And I went into a lot of those islands. And of course, they had pontoon docks. They were floating docks that could be moved, They were metal. And you'd tie up the side of those docks and unload on Army vehicle, or I say Army. Generally, it was what the trucks that we call 6x. They had 6 wheels. We called them 6x. And we'd just put a net over, drop it, and the trucks would take off. A lot of those islands in there. And you get on to some, I remember some of them, I believe it was one called Tinian. We went to it, and the Army had just moved out, and they just dropped everything. And all kinds of sporting equipment, and all kinds of stuff. They just dropped it, left it, gone. And that wasn't the only island, but that, I believe, Tinian was in my mind. Saipan, Midway, Eniwetok, lots of those islands. And Eniwetok, Guam. That was my last assignment, Guam. Okay, Saipan. There were 2 cliffs that I recall. that one was bonsai, another one was suicide. And it said that it is said that hundreds of bodies were seen of Japanese men and women. They were afraid to get caught by the Americans because they thought that the Americans would rape them, kill them and rape them, and so they were afraid. They were deathly afraid to get caught. And it's been said that there were thousands of bodies at the base of those cliffs. And then some have said that there were millions, hundreds of thousands of bodies where they just ran over the edge of the cliff and bonsai. I don't remember being on bonsai to get a picture taken, but I remember being on Suicide Cliff and looking over, and there was, if I'm not mistaken, there was a gun emplacement on Suicide Cliff. But a lot of people died by suicide and by gunfire. And then Guam, where I was last stationed, the equipment, all the equipment was coming my way. We had a warehouse on Island Command, or at Island Command, and if they'd find something here it came, here it would come, wind up with us. And I started to say with me, but I was a ranking storekeeper. There was another man, a seaman that worked with me. But when it came time for me to go home, Lieutenant Biggerstaff wanted me to stay. Offered me an increase, more promotion, upscale. But I wanted to go home, so I went home. And ultimately, it was the thing to do. Two other pretty good sized islands. Okay, a small island. Okay, see, I know we talked, I mentioned that. Iwo Jima, that was a small island, but it was a deadly island. I didn't go ashore. Where we were tied up, I could see from one end of the island to the other. But I didn't go ashore there. And then there's another island, pretty good sized island. I can't think of that island's name. I remember we went in there right behind a typhoon. And I remember a supply ship there, And they said that skip was made out of concrete. I guess it was, I don't know. And then we went around in a place called White Beach. The name of that? Formosa? No.
Wasn't
Oh,
Okinawa.
well, I forget that one. But, yeah, I remember they had a colored port battalion unloading the ships. And we went around there close to White Beach. And they unloaded our ship. And I remember, I think those guys got a hold of some whiskey. And they cursed me. And says, no so-and-so running back and forth through the United country gonna tell us what to do. And my officer got me a gun to use in case they came after me. Well, I would like to remember that island's name.
Wasn't Okinawa?
Huh?
Okinawa?
Yeah, Okinawa. Yeah, that's it. That was it. Okinawa. Uh-huh. Yeah, that was it. Yeah. Well, yeah, those were interesting. He's gone, isn't he? Yeah, he's gone. He's good. He really helps me. He and his wife both. And then later on, after I came back from Guam and was discharged from the Navy.
What year was that?
46. And then I lived in Greensboro, North Carolina at the time. And my wife and I, I say at the time, a little later, she and I moved to Greensboro. And here again, just like my daddy of years ago, I was looking for a job. And I got a job where he used to work, in a textile mill. And I was looking for a Naval Reserve unit, but there wasn't one. There was an Air Force Reserve unit. So I decided to join it. And then the Korean War came along. And I had experience in lumber and building materials. In fact, I was I was a lumber inspector slash pine inspector, grading lumber and that kind of thing. So they, the Air Force, they got you, you know, what are you capable of doing, you know. So when the Korean War came up, they were doing some other things other than Korea. They were going to build some air bases in Africa, and I think one in Spain, I'm not sure. But I do know that they were building them in Africa because I was there, a part of it. So they sent me to Morocco, where I'd been running in and out of in the Navy, you know. They sent me back because they were going to build these air bases. And they built one in right outside of Casablanca. And they called, the name of it was Nuasur. Okay. So when we got there, we were operating out of an old French air base. See, that's French Morocco.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we were operating out of that. And then they built, over at Nuasur, which was several miles outside of Casablanca. They built a bunch of huts for us to live in. If I'm not mistaken, there were 8-man huts called Dallas huts, plywood. And so they were building this air base and had a lot of earth moving equipment, whatever. And so that's, when we got over, okay, when we were over at the French air base, I had a bunch of Arabs, I was working a bunch of Arabs. Oh, I think at the gate to get into the area, I think they sold marijuana and all kinds of stuff there, you know. And these Arabs would they get happy during the day. They'd get happy, and they would steal stuff, you know. You know, in these United States, we have a definition of thing for words. You know, I think they have a different definition of every word. To tell a story to them means the truth. It doesn't mean a lie, it means truth, you know. Different meanings. And they carried a rug with them. And at their prayer time, they quit and kneel. Yeah. Carried that rug with them. And they'd get fatter during the day. You know, they wore those white things, you know, like a sheet, bed sheet. Well, they'd fill that they'd filling that thing up, you know, whatever. They get fatter as the day went on. yeah. Well, let's back up a little bit. Whenever whenever they were getting us together to go to Africa, they assembled us. We assembled at Lackland Air Force Base, East Lackland, in San Antonio, Texas, and then they put us on a ship, troop transport. 82nd. My service number is my Air Force service number 14391-490. I remember what it was. So I guess we were 14th Air Force. We were a supply depot wing. So we went from the United States on that transport to Bremerhaven, Germany. I did not go ashore, but I knew how ships worked. I knew how the ship company worked, having been in the Navy, and I knew how to get something to eat. I knew how to get the best groceries to eat. And I remember very well, beautiful day when we left Bremerhaven. We were a couple days out of Bremerhaven, beautiful day, sun shining. Seated, we were just, well, there were people everywhere, men everywhere. And it was up on the forward part of the ship. Dice rolling, dirty jokes going on, all kind of stuff. And the Lord said to me, I've got a better life than this for you. And I looked around at what was going on. And I said to the Lord, if you have, I want it. And that's where I accepted the Lord, right out there on that troop transport. And then I began to hunt Christians. Those guys that were, I'd see them in the mess hall after we got to Casablanca. I'd see them asking a blessing, any indication that they were a Christian, And that started my Christian pilgrimage. Well, when I got back and I was separated. I wasn't discharged. I was separated. That time being in a reserve unit, I just separated from active duty. And I went back to where I had worked. And I remember the boss man he, he was a Baptist preacher, but he said a bad word. Why in the blank didn't you come back when I needed you? Well, I didn't want to go back into that place. So I remember we went from that department, went back down the office to that plant. And they wanted to make an appointment with a doctor by the name of Standall, a head shrinker, to see if I was managerial material. And that scared me. It scared me. Because I didn't have the education that I needed. I had a 9th grade education. Ninth grade. And I remember going out of that office and the door closing behind me and me saying, I won't be back. I won't be back. I'm going to school somewhere, somehow. I'm going to school. I went right straight out back by where I lived. I lived in the, Greensboro, North Carolina, out on the Winston-Salem Road is where I lived, but I lived in the Guilford College community. The Winston-Salem Road, but the Guilford College community was over, the next road over, and there was a college over there, Guilford College. It was a Quaker school. So I lived in the Guilford College community. And our kids went to, later on, I didn't have any kids at that particular time. The kids went to Guilford High School, or Guilford School. The principal's name was Jenkins. Never forget it, as long as I live. I went out there and I said, Mr. Jenkins, can I go back to school? Yes, sir, it's a public school. He set me in a 10th grade class. And I sat there until just about Christmas. And he says, why don't you go take a GED test? Says, I believe you can pass it. I did. Went, took it, and passed it. Went back out there, oh, I passed it. He says, okay. Now then, he says, I believe the college will accept you. Go see if the college will accept you. So I went over to the college and they said, yeah, they accepted me. Well, it took, by that time I was working at the Western Electric Company. And in, at the Western, I was working at the Western. And so the Western Electric paid part of my tuition. It took me 10 years, I believe it was, 8 or 10, to go through 4 years of college. I didn't have sense enough to quit. I just kept going. Until I finished. Well, during that time, the Lord called me to preach and pastor. And I became the pastor in a church where some of the members, people I worked with, were in the church. There were two of the women that were in the church, Elsa Lee Butler and not Helen Snyder, but she was married to a Snyder anyway. Married to Red Snyder, and I don't remember what her name was. But I became their pastor, Gethsemane Baptist Church. And after I became their pastor, I wanted to go to seminary. It was 98 miles from my driveway to the parking lot at the seminary, at the old Wake Forest campus, Southeastern Seminary. So I went there and got my master's degree. And then I didn't stop until I got my doctorate degree, and I got that when I was 50 years old. And here I am. Here I am. It's been good. God is blessed. He has really blessed. Amazing grace. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. Makes you smile.
Absolutely.
That's my story. That's my story.
Mind if I ask you a couple of quick questions now? What was your most memorable experience in the service?
In the service? No, the most memorable. The most the most scary. Okay. We were, as I said a while ago, we were on merchant ships. And being on the merchant ships, we had waiters that took our order for food and served us. We had a waiter, black man. Now I might get this sort of mixed up, I don't know. A black man. And sometimes he's good at shuffling, you know. It's just like he put salt down on the deck, you know, and he just shuffled, you know. He's pretty good. But somehow or another, he got tangled up, got mad at a guy. And on those ships, your superstructure, you had a passageway on the starboard and port side, you know. So you could go down the passageway and go out the back, and come around and come. And he got it wrong with a guy. I don't know whether the guy was seeming to me like in my mind that guy was a Mexican or something. But he picked up a softball bat. Softball. A softball bat, the bowl of the bat's not quite as big as a regular baseball bat. but it's big enough to get you. And he got after that guy, and he caught him. And he hit him. He hit him behind the head. That's I think that's the most memorable. That's bad. But I don't remember whether I know they took him off ship, but I don't know whether he was dead or not. I just don't know. But it took them both off. One went one way, I'm sure, and one went the other way. I just don't know. But I say I had a couple of experiences, something like that. Yeah. Well, listen, experiences you don't. No, well, like I say, I wouldn't take anything for the experience that I've had, but I wouldn't want to go through it again. And you have these some, you just a lot of. Yeah. I think that's it.
What was the toughest thing you had to do in the service?
The toughest thing. I think the toughest thing I had to do was stay away from my wife. That's why I didn't retire in there. I loved that woman. I didn't. That's yeah. I went in there for. I had the idea that I wanted to retire in there, but to stay away from her, I didn't want to stay away from her, and I was told before I went over there, having been in the Navy, you know, and had so much time overseas, the officers did not think that I would go back. They thought I'd get stateside, you know. But they didn't know that I was called back to go overseas. And I didn't know it either till it was too late. And, she and I were married 69 years, 6 months and 2 days. Today's the 6th. She died June the 8th, 2013. And she was my baby. Yeah.
How did you cope with being away from your family?
Huh?
How did you cope with being away from your family?
Poorly. Poorly. I didn't have any children at the time. My son was born in '53.
That was right after you got out of the service,
Yeah,
right?
he was born December '53. Yeah. And we weren't any, we'd been married nearly 10 years whenever he was born. And then we were married 8 years after he was born, before my daughter was born. She's lives in Augusta. That's where we lived. When we moved here because she had Alzheimer's. My wife. She had Alzheimer's. And it was getting to where I needed some help. And of course my daughter worked in a pharmacy and in a state hospital. And she couldn't get off like Ernie could, you know. Ernie could, he was his own boss, practically, so. Well, he was his own boss in Bainbridge anyway. His boss man was in Chicago.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I've told you more than enough now. More than enough.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm glad I could do it.
And on behalf of the Military Education Preservation Project, I just want to thank you for your service again, and thank you for your time and willingness to share your experiences with us.
Yeah.
We greatly appreciate it.
Maybe it'll do somebody some good sometime.